Okay. So can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Hopefully. Yeah, great. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to talk about how to write eco-poetry. Obviously, I'm really going to be primarily talking about my own practice. I can't claim to speak about eco-poetry in general. There's many eco-poetries out there. So this is my take on it, my practice of sort of getting near 20 years of walking this path. So yeah, here we go. So there's lots of ways in which you could define eco-poetry, and I put forward various definitions, but this is one, and I thought it was perhaps most relevant for this webinar series addressing Dear Politicians. So there is very much an activist engagement. I see eco-poetry as using poetry to change the world, to create ecological, social, political change. So it's not just, for me, it's not just the ecological, it does comprise the social dimension, political. I've identified 4 major themes in my work: a theme of witnessing, a theme of connection or reconnection with nature, and ourselves. I'll talk a bit more about that I'll talk more about all of these themes as we go through. Visioning and resistance. And there is an essay online if you search. I think it might be linked from my website as well, which is titled "What is Eco-Poetry?" I wrote it quite a few years ago, so it probably needs updating, but I do discuss those themes in that talk, in that essay. So I thought I'd just touch on some of my influences to start with. Gary Snyder, the American eco-poet, now a real elder, a real wise being, and I have a lot of respect for him and his work. And this is a great quote from him: "Nature is not a place to visit, it is home." I might also add, it's our wider body. So that's something that I explore in my work, this sense of it as home, as wider body. I do draw quite a lot on political poetry. This is a wonderful anthology edited by Carolyn Forshey, who's an amazing poet in her own right, and was very much involved in witnessing the atrocities of the authoritarian regime in El Salvador in the 70s. This is her anthology Against Forgetting 20th Century Poetry of Witness. So that theme of witness comes through, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. I'm not just influenced by poets, but also by eco-psychologists, eco-theologians. This is Thomas Berry's idea of the ecozoic era. We've heard quite a lot in recent years about notions of the Anthropocene era, which understands that humans have come to have a really negative impact on all aspects of the planetary system. But Berry wants to put forward an alternative vision of an era of regeneration, of living in harmony with the earth as our community. And so I draw on that idea, on his work, The Dream of the Earth, which I'd thoroughly recommend. Here's a great beat poet, or in the beat tradition, Anne Wallman. You might want to look up this great YouTube of her performing it's a sort of sung poem, Uh-Oh Plutonium, which she uses to raise issues around nuclear energy, nuclear power. Ken Saro-Wiwa, Nigerian poet, writer, activist, murdered by Nigerian government in 1993. So yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from people who've really stood up, spoken truth to power, and even risked their lives. So just briefly touching into the context of my work, I'm very aware of the white supremacist, patriarchal, imperialist, industrial disaster capitalism. That is the economic system that we're many of us deeply impacted by living in, well, I say all of us to lesser or greater extents. But I also see the poly crises that are created by disaster capitalism, including the housing crisis many of us are impacted by currently in the UK and in many parts of the world, as well as the ecological crisis, the huge gap in wealth, as being a crisis of perception and imagination. And obviously as a poet, that's kind of very much my territory, to explore aspects of perception and imagination. So I'm going to start talking about specific poems, and I'm going to start off talking about how they came into being, because obviously if we're going to talk about how to write eco-poetry, we want to think about what inspires us. And so this is an image, as you can imagine, of the polar caps melting because of human created climate change, global warming. And about 10 years ago, I was watching footage of the melting ice sheets in the Arctic, and I recall feeling both devastated and awed by the slow motion footage of these giant walls of ice literally crashing down into the ocean. And I had a sense that I wanted to mythologize this process as a major event of our lifetime. And I think as human beings, we are hardwired to be meaning makers. I believe we have a deep need for imagery to represent and heighten our awareness of our dramatically changing world. So I drew on folk tales from the Russian tradition and chose the figure of the Ice Queen to represent the landscapes of the Arctic, and then developed my poem around this archetype. And at the same time, the research I'd previously been doing for a children's book about the Arctic peoples and animals made me conscious of the impacts of the climate crisis on all beings who inhabit this region. So I wanted to include them within this mythological framework. So that's the inspiration behind the poem that I'm now going to share with you. Ice, an elegy. The Ice Queen is leaving. All around her ancient kingdom is cracking up, trickling, splitting as her vast crystal sleigh grinds on the fast track to oblivion. For millennia, she held her huge mirror steady to the sun. Now she's losing her cool, sheets shrinking, her albedo body pocked with melting pools, moulins milling in, shoots of water sailing her the slipway of lost forever. Yet each day her belly carves desperate bergs of ice. Bereft, these tongues curl and shrink as they sense their mother's spent. Her skin once tinted blue, now deathly pale. Her courtiers and creatures are disappearing too. In despair, they throw their arms into the air. School maidens, once yoked in lustrous bridal gowns, stagger one by one to their knees, faces crashing down in mounds into the sea. Even the glacial snowmen who plucked boulders and carried their erratic cargo across continents now stumble, retreat, valleys scoured by their dark rheumatic wake. Everywhere, foxes, bears, wolverines, and leopards mourn their queen, prowling the rosaries of Paternoster lakes. They murmur eulogies and prayers. And at last, we hurry in with tools, instruments, and measuring rods to probe, extend our senses, to scientize this demise of ice. So you might have noticed as I was reading that poem and you were perhaps looking at it on your screen, you might have noticed that the names of the more than human species in the poem were deliberately capitalized. And this is part of my practice as an eco-poet, to increase their visibility literally on the page, to raise them from the margins to which Western culture has relegated them. So I thought I'd share too that nice little picture of a wolverine, a wonderfully amazing being from the Arctic. So yeah, so I want to touch into aspects of form. So that poem that I shared is free verse. I do occasionally also employ traditional verse forms, such as a sonnet, pantoum, haiku, haibun, and I will share an example of a sonnet later on in my talk. But what I'm most interested in as a poet who, I'm not primarily a performance poet, I'm a poet who's interested in words on the page, obviously, as well as sharing my work through readings, but I'm really interested in poetry as what I see it as 2D sculpture on the page, and to really explore how form reflects and amplifies content or meaning. So often I'm playing with line length, and also, as I'll come to show you, increasingly typography, because I've been finding ways to share the pages and words, the text, in non-traditional sort of spaces, i.e. books or online, but actually on gallery walls. So I'll show you that in a minute. So just going back to a little fragment from Ice and Elegy. So you can see there that I've really, as I've been crafting this poem, I've been really thinking about line length. So in despair, they throw their arms into the air. There's this sense of this longer line there, which might physically represent arms going into the air, and the sense of sort of using the relationship of the text and the white page to, you know, explore how the ideas of the poem could be visually represented. And in the second stanza there, once yoked in lustrous bridal gowns, stagger one by one to their knees, faces crashing down in mounds into the sea. So there's a sense of the lines literally representing that sense of staggering. And of course, with the shorter lines, it creates more of a sort of staccato effect, stagger one by one to their knees. So it kind of also sonically represents this sense of the falling down of these walls of ice into the ocean. So that's just a little insight into how I often explore representing ideas on the page. So for me, a big part of writing eco-poetry is bringing together the imagination and research. So I really love researching different topics, often scientific. That's what I've been working with a lot, actually collaborating with scientists in the field. And I believe that sometimes it's a sort of an act of translation of the science, using the poetic imagination, also to inspire deeper compassion. So often, you know, science is very much speaking to the head, whereas when we translate it through poetry, it can speak more to the heart, so it can awake more compassion, more empathy. And I love this quote from the wonderful novelist Lindsay Clark: "Compassion is an act of the imagination." I'm going to share with you in a moment a piece which is written from the perspective actually of a climate scientist. So it's what we would call a dramatic monologue. So it's written in the first person, and I'm trying to ventriloquize or inhabit the voice of the climate scientist. So we can never presume when we're writing, if we're or when we're reading a poem, that just because it's written in the first person, that it is the poet speaking, him or herself, or themselves. So we have to be open to the possibility that the perspective is coming from someone other than the poet, and this is clearly evident in this next piece, in this dramatic monologue. So Climate Scientist Speaks is the name of the piece, and it starts with an epigraph. So this is something, when we're writing poetry, we can insert sometimes quotes from other people, which maybe add another dimension to the poem. So Heraclitus, as you may know, is an ancient Greek philosopher, and he's talking about the Sibyl. You may know the figure of the Sibyl, who was a prophetess who would perhaps sit in a wild place, maybe inhaling fumes of burning plants or of sulfurous fumes being emitted from the earth, and perhaps entering an altered state of consciousness would utter prophecies. So the oracle at Delphi is a famous one. And the Sibyl was traditionally a woman. And so I love this quote from Heraclitus: "The Sibyl with frenzied mouth, uttering things not to be laughed at, unadorned and unperfumed, yet reaches to 1,000 years with her voice by aid of the god." So in reading the perspectives of different climate scientists, I was very interested, particularly in some female climate scientists. And this was the poem that I made in response to the research and my own imaginative process. Our integrated Earth system is a thing of beauty, the work of algorithms and differential equations. In the calm of the lab, I sit by a plasma screen observing the kaleidoscopic patterns of sea ice concentrations. Through the laws and logic focusing my mind, I peer into the future. Arachne, our supercomputer, makes 600 trillion calculations per second, weaves themes of spiraling instability. With a tap on my touchscreen, I look through distant eyes in the sky. Polar orbiters that monitor deep water currents, surface temperatures, and melting rates of glaciers and ice sheets. Data drops into my office like subterranean water in a limestone cave, leaving ever more profound impressions. Often I'm gazing thousands of years into the past. Oops, so sorry. I'm just having a problem because I can't read the very top line of my page. That's so annoying because I've got something in the way. Oh, don't know how to get rid of it. Anyway, analysing cryospheric systems, evidence from borings in ice caps, those giant glassy scrolls chronicling periods of global heating and cooling. Unforeseen results appear like rays of sunlight piercing the atrium of a temple. Then my mind fledges hypotheses that rise on thermal currents. I race to track them down, start the next phase of rigorous assessment. When the media publishes my findings, or I report with colleagues to Congress, there's always the hope that this time our work will make a difference. Mostly, I feel as if I'm speaking with addicts on the subject of their habit, the harm it's doing them and others, the denial of this truth. Back home, I well up as my kids play at being adults, their make-believe shaped by the only world they know. Oh, but my angels, the unraveling web. So that was a piece from my most recent collection, The Mother Country, which came out in 2019. And as I'm sure you can get a real sense of the research that sort of went into that piece. I don't have a scientific background, so that was very much drawing on the testimonies of climate science to create that piece. So something I've been working a lot with in recent years is the long form, long poems, and particularly around landscape. And so what I'm interested there is creating a sequence of linked poems, thematically linked poems. I often liken it to being like tracks on a concept music album. So they stand alone, they can be read alone, but they all kind of link together, and it creates this sort of collage, cumulative effect. Often the sections can juxtapose perspectives and voices, human, more than human, and it can create a sort of sculptural bio tapestry that reflects different elements of a landscape. So this represents the Dorset landscape, which I've recently been exploring through a project with Cape Farewell, which is an organisation based in Dorset that brings together artists and scientists to respond primarily to the climate crisis. And we were looking at impacts of the climate crisis and pollution on the river system that feeds into Poole Bay. And over the course of a year, and with the benefit of Arts Council funding, I created this piece, Dorset Water Bodies, a Common Wheel, which is in 5 sections, which are represented there. You can hear the whole piece recorded on my SoundCloud if you're interested. It's SoundCloud, Helen Moore, Ecopoet, and there are links from my website as well. I'm going to read a little bit of the second section, Migrant Story, just to give you a flavour of that. This migrant story touches into the journey of the salmon. Many people aren't aware that salmon live in the chalk streams of Dorset and travel up to the high Arctic to feed and then return. And so this is the opening section of Migration Story. And as you can see here, I've really been exploring quite a lot how the words appear on the page, and yeah, the idea of Atlantic warming in that second line. So the word warming, the font gets bigger to represent that sense of something growing, getting more intense. And then the word elusive is written with the letters spaced out, because that is to represent the way that, because of the warming of the Atlantic, the food sources are moving northward, and there is evidence that the salmon's food sources are becoming less available, so that salmon are literally starving, hungry by the time they do reach the Arctic waters. So yeah, that's just a little snippet of that piece. I'll just read it. Migration Story. Outbound, her belly gnawed for hundreds of miles northward. Food sources elusive with Atlantic warming. Now from Arctic waters, she-fish comes skirting our coastline, a silver torpedo fattened on capelin and 8 tentacled squid. Attuned via iron in her head to Earth's geomagnetic compass, hen salmon surfs in-channel currents, Lizard Point, Start Point, Portland Bill, where North Sea cools, Gulf Stream. And as I mentioned, I've been exploring recently having my work within a gallery space, so collaborating with some visual artists at Cape Farewell. I had text on the walls, these long printouts of text, but also transfers of text that were directly applied to the wall, just some different sections. And that sculpture that you can see there to my right was also connected with one of the sections of Dorset water bodies. And this piece was the Nightmare slurry spill section. So I literally got an old milk churn from a local farm and created this pool of milk, which then doubled up as a page, a blank page with text that I hand wrote on it. That was quite interesting, having that in the gallery space, and it certainly prompted some reactions from people. So I do have this activist intention with my work. I do want people to engage more deeply with the land, and you know, by working with local communities, maybe helping them to see the landscape they inhabit in a different way. And so I do have a sense, an intention of eco-poetry being a restorative act, a signpost towards regenerative cultures, where we value the earth, and particularly the land or bioregion we inhabit as our community. So that is very much part of the sort of activist intention that I have as an eco-poet. So just moving on now, Ecozoa was my second collection, came out in 2015. You might recognise an echo of that title, Ecozoa, from Thomas Berry's Ecozoic era, and that very much influenced the idea of Ecozoa. And we're going to share a couple of pieces from Ecozoa. This first one, Climate Adaptation #1, just this very short piece, and I'll talk a bit more about my idea behind it in a moment, so I'll just read it first. Climate Adaptation #1. I'm building ditches, ponds, puddled with clay. I'll grow skeins of watercress and webbed feet. My skin may turn subtly responsive, secrete moisture like a rounded hymen. My vocal sac would pulse at mud, the boggy rack of wetlands. So I'm sort of playing here with the idea. We know that we need to adapt to climate change, but here there's a sense of really a physical adaptation. And I do have a sense of myself, of us all as humanimals. We aren't separate from nature, and so I like to explore ways in which I can reconnect with my own humanimal nature and the shared sentience of the more than human world. And so in kind of crafting this piece, I wanted to explore not end rhyme, which is often used a lot in particularly performance poetry. That's a strong characteristic of performance poetry. So when, like, feet secrete, that's the end rhyme, when the words rhyme at the end of the lines. So I use that a little bit, but I would never generally have end rhyme going all the way through a poem. What I'm more interested in is kind of creating a sonic tapestry, particularly using internal rhyme, and often assonantal rhyme, which is linking vowel sounds through rhyme. So we've got the A sound in clay and skeins and may, creating a thread of internal rhyme there, and then sack and rack in the last two couplets. And for me, it's often about linking ideas or words. Often when I'm crafting a poem, it kind of happens unconsciously, and it's often only subsequently that I'll kind of notice these patterns coming out. So, you know, I do work quite sort of intuitively when I'm writing, but, you know, it is interesting to notice this sense of connecting with the earth, with the clay, with the plants, the skeins of watercress, and this sense of potential. My skin may turn subtly responsive. So, this sense of this adaptation that may occur through this deep connection or reconnection with nature, and then this sense of really becoming maybe like a frog, this vocal sac that could pulse at mud. So yeah, that was sort of what I was playing around with in that piece. The next climate adaptation I'm going to share with you is a very different one, and it's very much touching into the kind of visionary aspect of eco-poetry that I think is very important, because I do believe that the popular imagination has been totally hijacked by apocalypse. We're bombarded all the time by hugely negative media of war, of terror, of destruction, and we very rarely are given positive visions of the future. And yet there are so many hundreds of thousands of projects out there across the world that stand for ecological and social regeneration, justice. And so I do believe that it's very important as an eco-poet to have this strand of visioning regenerative futures. So this is sort of a parallel in the visual arts. Alan Marshall's Ecotopia 2121 that was made in 2016, a vision of a future London. I wasn't actually aware of this piece until after I wrote my next piece that I'm going to share with you, Climate Adaptation #2, but I've sort of found it subsequently and thought, oh, that was interesting. Because this piece was made probably around the same time he was making his piece. So I'll read it for you. Climate Adaptation #2. The sun presses down with many hands. We are pig iron smelted in the furnace. Trafalgar Square bakes like Tahrir Square without its people. And we have slowly adapted, come out at night when it's cooler, stroll the canals fashioned by the uprisings of the Thames. Little Venice has spread. We're the Venice of the North, now the original has gone. And there's no choice but to be in what's left of Europe. Mother Earth has moored humanity together at her table, and she's at the center of all our decisions. From our boat, I watch the river swimming with the gibbous moon. We use her light to sow our seeds and harvest every month when she dies. We live by lunulations, have become silvery left-handed humans who see their shadows, and feminine in ways that men and women had forgotten how to be. My beloved and I have taken rooms in a moon palace. We enjoy the circularity of life inside the straw bale towers with our fine lunar gardens out on the roof. At dusk, the neighborhood collective meets to plan the night's work. The scent of jasmine sweetens the air. In the dark, I've heightened senses for finding all our herbs and medicines. Like our planet, we're slowly convalescing. To celebrate, my guild of astronomers has polished a lunar. Our tidal-powered moon clock may be copied by surviving cities all around the world. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm sort of rattling through this fairly swiftly because I want to allow time for questions at the end. So I did promise to touch into a traditional verse form. So that piece that I've just shared obviously is just a single block of text. And again, it's in the voice of somebody from future generations, who knows when exactly, maybe also 21, I don't know. But this next piece is deliberately taking the sonnet form and thoroughly subverting it. So there's a great tradition in poetry of satire, and I love some of the satirists that have worked in the English language and also other languages. So it's also obviously great to read poetry in translation, and just want to drop in there when we're wanting to learn to write poetry. We need to be reading poetry very widely as well to get inspired. But as I'm sure you're aware, the sonnet is obviously very associated with Shakespeare and with love. So that's you know, a very ready association we do make with the sonnet, this little song. It comes originally from the Italian, from Petrarch. So the word sonnet means little song. It's traditionally a 14-line piece, and it has a particular structure, which I don't really have time to go into now. But contemporary poets will take the basic sonnet form and subvert it in different ways. And so I have done that with this next piece that I'm going to share with you. And instead of it really being a love poem, it is a deeply satirical piece, which is quite edgy, really. So brace yourselves. So this is Capitalism, a sonnet. Chemical, macaque, GlaxoSmithKline, Roche, trepanned brain baboon, Max Factor eyes burning cat, L'Oreal rabbit, the devil wears perfume. Oh dear, EasyJet, Ryanair, melting reindeer, polar bear, but a bargain for McDonald's, Earth's rainforest slashed as Asians sweat for Adidas, Nike, the evil empire's goddess. Oh, bless all ecocidal patriarchs, so smart in suits, Armani uniforms, a cocktail of intellect and greed, hellish stuff they puppet us to need. So there is often a traditional feature of a sonnet that the last couplet rhyme, end rhymes. So you can see that there with greed and need. But yeah, it's very unusual to see a sonnet written like this. You may also notice that I've continued this practice here of capitalizing the names of the more than human creatures, but I've deliberately given lowercase letters for the names of brands like EasyJet, Ryanair. Normally we obviously see them with capital E, capital R. So that's another kind of idea with sort of subverting the capitalist order and kind of raising the status, as I mentioned earlier, of the more than human beings. So just want to come into concluding section about the role of the poet. So when we're thinking about writing poetry, we want to, you know, think about our role. Joy Harjo featured here, first Indigenous American poet laureate, wonderful poet, eco-poet, highly recommend you check out her work if you don't know it. So obviously poet laureate can fulfill a certain role within a nation, culture. In America, they don't just have one poet laureate, they also have state poet laureate. So there's poet laureate of New York State, for example, etc. So that creates a bit more diversity and possibility. Here in the UK, the poet laureate is very tied to royalty, to the Queen. So I'd imagine that it would be pretty tricky to write the kind of poems that I write. subverting capitalism and everything, and be invited to become poet laureate. So I'm very clear that my role is not going to be about maintaining the status quo. It is being about a willingness to speak truth to power, and that, to be totally honest, hasn't done me terribly many favors over the years, but I believe passionately that the ideas and the awareness that I have, and that is inspired by many brave activists, often need to be communicated. I have also engaged in activism as well, and that informs my work and my sense of myself as a poet, my willingness to speak out. So yeah, I don't have any prescriptive ideas about what it means to be a poet, but I think we have to think about that. We have to think about what we're willing to communicate, and self-censorship is an aspect of any writer's practice. You know, what do we include, what do we leave out? And you know, there are some poets who are willing to be very political and others less so. So yeah. Anyway, I'm going to share this piece, which touches more into my own personal experience. And obviously I was speaking earlier about the I voice, the first person perspective in a poem, not necessarily being allied with the poet. But in this poem, this is a poem that I'm very willing to share as being very biographical, and it very much touches into my sense of myself as a poet. I grew up sort of with 80s Thatcherism. My father was very much a sort of Thatcherite self-made man, and he would regularly tell me, bless him, very much with the idea of wanting me to succeed in the world, that he would regularly say it's a dog-eat-dog world out there and it's survival of the fittest. And I was given those kinds of messages as a young woman, and I suppose a lot of my life has been about unpacking that conditioning and learning to kind of develop my own perspective on things. So the title, Climbing Out of the Dog-Eat-Dog World, is sort of very much touching into that. The epigraph from Viktor Frankl, I don't know if you're aware of his works, is that he was a Holocaust survivor, and he went on to be an amazing psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, wrote an incredible book called Man's Search for Meaning, which very much explores his experience in concentration camps during the Second World War. And I found this quote very inspiring when I was dealing with a lot of climate anxiety, as it's come to be termed. Well over a decade ago, I was really coming to terms with what was happening with our planet, and feeling, you know, despair and really struggling. And I found this this quote from Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning just incredibly helpful. I thought, well, you know, if a Holocaust survivor can write this, then surely, you know, I can, you know, sort of step up in a similar way. So he says, there's nothing in the world, I would venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life. And so this is my poem in response to that idea. Climbing out of a dog-eat-dog world. There's this fear in growing up that your parents' genes will one day kick in, and perhaps they already have. I'm a human body, a personality, and also a soul. As such, I tell myself, I've chosen this pain. Why else would I be here as the planet's heating up, if not to speak of the Holocaust we've unleashed on this universal jewel? Earth life unique with its Goldilocks conditions. So many creatures lighting out. Human box turtle, Caspian tiger, paradise parrot, golden toad. I cradle your dark spaces as rainforests dwindle and painted Kayapo people march for living rivers, trees, these natural riches they steward for their children. Men, women so proud and strong, yet almost naked in the midst of the rushing, wasted city. What can a poet do? Bear witness, be a conscience, perhaps. Sometimes I feel such agony to see what ignorance and greed are snuffing out. Yet somehow I find the inner rungs to climb from despair. Hand over hand, there's always something to learn. Love is my meaning. Through it, I'm sure of nothing but a personal evolution. Darwinists may reject this notion, but in this lifetime, I know I'm evolving as I have in others before. Maybe I'll manage more than my parents ever could. Now, I notice when my heart has closed. Only the heart breaks patterns of fear. Together, we can make a being, love, being world. And there's an image of some amazingly courageous Kayapo women protesting for the Amazon, against the destruction of the Amazon. So this is my last little bit, really. It's a bit of a provocation, but I often say to people, because people sometimes say to me, well, you know, eco poetry, you know, why not just call it poetry? And ultimately, I would like to see a future where we do just call it poetry. So a future without eco poetry per se. We have no choice but to participate in co-creating a world for which our children's children will thank us. And I do believe that if we all collectively work on that endeavour, we'll no longer need to have this prefix of eco-poetry that signifies something different from regular poetry. And so that's my vision, a world where eco-poetry will simply be poetry again. So that's the end of my talk. If you want to find out more about my work, my website's helenmorepoet.com. And just one last little plug, I do offer online mentoring. I run in-person, on-site and online workshops and retreats. So do get in touch if any of that interests you, if you'd like to go on a journey of developing your eco-poetic skills through my Wild Ways to Writing programme. I'm very happy to talk to you. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd love to hear any questions that we may have time for.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was amazing talk. I was wondering, we only have a couple more minutes. If anyone has any questions, maybe in the chat or from this room. You can either unmute yourself. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh, I'm just looking at the chat as well. It's great to see some of the comments there. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, sorry, was there a question?
Hello there. Yes, it's Kathy here, Helen.
Oh, Kathy, great
Hello.
to see you.
Great
Hello,
to see you
thanks
too.
for joining me today.
That's okay. Apologise if my voice is a little croaky. I'm still getting over COVID.
Oh, bless you.
There's been a lot of coughing going on. So just 2 or 3 things. I don't want to hog too much time, but I was discussing eco poetry with some fellow poets of a similar generation to me, put it that way, in their 60s. And how am I going to overcome this attitude? And they're very good poets. Oh, it's all political, isn't it? You know, well, anything's political, really, isn't it? So I'm trying to woo people over, really, and wondering how best to approach that. But also a couple of other things. You know,
can I just stop you for
yes,
1 second,
sorry.
Meg, just to speak to that? You know, it's so interesting. I think sometimes you know, with older generations, and I don't want to kind of make any particular assumptions about the people that you may have been speaking with, but I think that I often find that people who have a degree of economic privilege can afford to be apolitical, because they're not maybe very directly touched by some of the issues that eco-poetry may be addressing. So I think that that's really important to bear in mind. And I do notice that that reaction often comes from people with a lot of privilege. When people don't have privilege, they have to be political because they're aware of where the power lies, where the power structure leaves them often in a less privileged place. So
yeah, that's a very good point, and I will make it. Sorry, I don't know if somebody else wants to ask a question, but just a couple more issues really. I'm interested to know of any good sources of research really that you might recommend, and also you know, eco-poets, other eco-poets that you value that we might get.
right.
Anyway, that's me done. Thank you.
Okay, so when you're saying about sources of research, what did you mean?
Well, you had a section on poetry and research. And where do you tend to go to look at facts that one might use?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends. So obviously I was speaking about, you know, having directly worked with some scientists in the field. So I was working with microbiologists, with oceanographers and some river ecologists on that project. So I was very fortunate in that I was able to really look directly at their work, and, you know, to have even them explaining things to me in the field, showing me things. So that was really amazing. Other eco-poets, there's a wonderful Welsh eco-poet, Susan Richardson, whose work maybe you know. I'd really recommend her. She and I have collaborated on different projects. Anne Elvey in Australia, I've also collaborated with. It's really exciting to you know, realise, of course, that eco-poetry is an international movement. I've collaborated also with Massimo D'Arcangelo, who's an Italian eco-poet, and he and Anne Elvey and I co-created a bilingual Italian-English collection of eco-poetry that came out in 2017. So I'd really encourage you to, yeah, look beyond just Britain. So that's it. I mean, I could go on a lot more, but that's just a super quick answer because I'm aware.
Wonderful.
That,
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Things coming in the chat. Does anybody want to ask a question, and I'll try and look at the chat at the same time?
I just pick up on that comment that Catherine made, and the talking about older generation and the question of privilege. I think sometimes the fact that some, and I'm being general here, some older poets are in a position of privilege allows them to ruffle feathers that they might not otherwise want to. They might be that they are as politically aware, and actually their privilege gives them a little bit more freedom sometimes to
well, that's wonderful.
Stick their elbows
that's the
out.
case.
Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's the case. I was
I'm just putting a bit of balance into the discussion.
Yeah, I was picking up from Kathy the opposite, but maybe, you know, but yeah, it's absolutely, obviously, if somebody is privileged, then
I'm just thinking of all the old over 60s, shall we put it politely, who camped out on Extinction Rebellion things, and actually
absolutely
didn't give a toss whether they got arrested because they got to that time of their life where
absolutely, and that's wonderful. That's so wonderful, and it's really important also to recognize that, you know, people who are struggling to pay the rent, etc., you know, often they can't afford to risk being arrested because, you know, that they have no support to, you know, to take that risk. So the more that people who have privilege can step into that, you know, absolutely. And I do know some some wonderful women in their 70s who've been doing exactly that, getting involved with XR and doing great work. So yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, Angie. It's really important. Okay, I'm going to try and address a couple of things in the chat. Helen, how can young eco-poets, millennial, Gen Z, bridge the gap between the technical aspects of climate change crisis and driving a wide-reaching conversation around the subject with their work? I'm not sure exactly I'm understanding. Divya, is that how you pronounce your name? I don't know if you want to actually unmute and sort of maybe unpack a bit your question, because I'm not quite sure what you mean about the technical aspects of climate change crisis. Are you meaning maybe just sort of some of the science, the technicalities of the science? Is that maybe what you're meaning?
Yes, yes, Helen, that's true. That is what
yeah.
I mean when I mention technical aspects. So we are also trying to kind of have a conversation with the younger generation as eco-poets to help them understand the urgency of the situation. So how can eco-poets with their work, with their poems and pieces, kind of bridge that gap between the technical aspects and, you know, driving a casual conversation to begin with, maybe?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Divya. Thank you. I think, like I was saying before about it, it's, you know, that kind of combination of imagination and research. So sort of finding imaginative forms sometimes to communicate to the heart as well as the head. I haven't kind of in this talk had time to go in at all into the wild writing aspect of my creative practice, but for me, it's also really important to have a deeply embodied relationship with the more than human world. And that, you know, is very much coming out of sensory engagement, intuitive engagement, you know, really being deeply present in the body and sensing, you know, the more than human world around us. Also, you know, I was sort of touched on the, you know, the sense that we are humanimals and really inhabiting that, reclaiming our wild selves and connecting with our dreams, which also give us information about what's going on. So it's about, you know, finding ways to communicate what we're understanding, you know, perhaps speaking in a way that is more than just technical, you know, because the technical is being communicated by the scientists, and you know, just speaking to people's intellects is clearly not enough. We need to touch people's hearts. We need to touch people at other levels beyond just the head. So the imagination, the sensory engagement can be really important to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you so much for all the questions. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for more, but I'm sure if you have any more questions, you can just drop me an email or go on the website, and I have some information about Helen and how you can reach her. I just had a final question. If you want to end up on, like, if someone would like to write eco-poetry, if there are any tips from you that they could use, you know, where to start and kind of all of that.
Yeah, oh my goodness. I mean, I think it's just following your passions and your interests, you know, and when we feel moved to tears by something, when we feel angry about something, you know, or when we feel awe-inspired, you know, just being willing to, poetry is about an act of attention. And so often we live in a world where it's just sort of, you know, moving to the next thing, scrolling on. So poetry is about deliberately stopping, dropping into the body, connecting, and being willing to take the time to find language to communicate our experiences. So it's about developing, you know, mindfulness practice to support our creative practice, and to read widely. As I said earlier, it's so important to read other poets, to read eco-poets, to get inspiration.
Thank you so much, Helen. Thank you all for coming. Next week, we have one more workshop with British eco-poet Daniel Fraser. So if you'd like to sign up for that, you can do that on the website. And thank you so much for joining today.
Thanks, everyone. It's
Thank
such
you.
a
Bye.
pleasure to talk with you today. Bye-bye.